and welcome. My name is Nigella Hilgarth, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Birch Aquarium. And welcome to the latest Jeffrey B. Graham Perspectives on Ocean Science lecture. And it is my great pleasure this evening to introduce Dr. Drew Talley. And he got his bachelor's degree at San Diego State, and then he got his PhD here at Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UC San Diego. And he not only is a local San Diegan, but he also now is at the University of San Diego. He is an assistant professor in biological oceanography. And he really specializes on the coastal ecosystems, particularly the interaction of land and ocean. And he also has published many book chapters, scientific publications, and something very dear to my heart. He is part of a very special organization called the Ocean Discovery Institute that we work with a lot in our education department, and he's their science advisor. And I'm very excited. I love the name of his talk this evening, which has the word aliens in it, which really intrigued me, though I think he probably means biological invaders by that. So please help me to welcome Dr. Talley to the Birch Aquarium. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank everyone here for coming out to see me. And also, thank you for inviting me to speak here. It's a great honor to be doing that, and particularly for me because Jeff Graham was a member of my thesis committee when I was at Scripps, so it's a great honor to be speaking at the Perspectives series. I should probably start by saying that I tried to be provocative with my title, Subsidies and Aliens, but there will be no talk of economics or immigration policy in this talk. So, but I thought I might draw some people in who were expecting something different. Instead, what I'm going to be talking about is habitat connections. So let me start by saying these are sort of the three main foci, the main things that I really study. I study land-sea food webs, I study wetland ecology, and I do a lot of work in outreach and education. And my job tonight is to sort of talk about habitat connections. You'll see that theme woven through the work that I do in all these fields. So the idea is to talk, I'll start by sort of explaining to you what I mean by habitat connectivity, and then I'll give a couple of sort of solid examples of it, land-sea interface connections, and then intertidal pelagic, and I'll explain that later. I'll talk about the importance of connectivity, and then I'll give several examples that, from other research that I've done and other projects that I've worked on. And just as background, a lot of sort of the general framework of what I'm talking about today can be found in this book chapter that I wrote with some collaborators from UC Davis. All right, so let's start with what connectivity is. When people talk about connectivity between habitats, they're usually talking about things like metapopulations or island-mainland relationships, island biogeography you might think of, or corridors. We've talked about, I think I was speaking with someone just a few minutes ago about corridors and how you have areas where to allow animals to go from one urban canyon, say, to another. So those are all really important and have been really profitable for the field of ecology. What they're talking about, each one of these, if you look at the examples, is an example of a connection between two similar habitats across an area that you might consider a non-habitat. Like islands, you know, you're thinking of the ocean as being non-habitat. So while I think these are very fruitful investigations to look at, I'm actually not going to be looking at these arrows here, but instead I'm going to be looking at these arrows here, where we're talking about connections across two very different types of habitats. So let me start by giving you a definition of what exactly I mean by connectivity. What we decided on when we were working on this book was, after great argument, we came up with two habitats are connected when one system, including biotic and or abiotic components, significantly affects another distinct ecosystem, which sounds kind of fancy, but when you think about it, it's both sort of intuitive and it's also kind of unsatisfying, because it's kind of squishy. It's not really telling you what we're using the word significantly affecting, and we're saying distinct ecosystem. And while that sounds like we're kind of trying to weasel out of making a firm decision there, the reality is we think it's important to keep that ambiguity there, because what you consider a distinct ecosystem depends on the organisms you're talking about, it depends on the habitats you're examining, and it depends on the investigator themselves, if they're an oceanographer or if they're a coastal ecologist. So broadly, that's what we mean by them. And when you think about habitat linkages, what I hope to show you today is they're pretty ubiquitous. They occur across almost any two habitats you could think about. They've, for a long time, been recognized in an informal manner, but one of the things, it's more recently that people have really started to focus on them and recognize that they're pretty fundamental to a lot of ecosystems, and they've really been poorly integrated into the sciences. So if you break these habitat linkages, or these connections, I'll use those terms interchangeably, if you break them down into different sort of categories, no matter how you think of them, they invariably involve either the movement of energy, organisms, or material across some boundary or another. The one exception, which I'm not going to go into today, is there is such a thing as a behavioral linkage, and that's where the behavior of an organism in one habitat, say an owl, might cause a change in behavior of an organism in a different habitat, say a small rodent that was worrying about being eaten by that owl. So there are behavioral linkages where nothing's really moving between those habitats, but we'll leave that aside for tonight's discussion. So what we thought about was, well, how would you categorize linkages? What are the different aspects of linkages that would be important to an ecologist to try and understand a system? And one of the things we came up with is that you can think of them as having four sort of dichotomous axes. You can think of them as having directionality, whether or not they have feedback, what temporal scale they occur on, or do they occur on the scale of hours, or is this a longer, it happens on the scale of years? And also whether or not they're biotically or abiotically mediated. So what's actually causing this connection? And we recognize that most of these things, like directionality, the reality is it's rarely, it's either 100% unidirectional or it's 100% bidirectional. Most of these things are somewhere in that gray area. But using this framework, we think, helps us to sort of tease apart these linkages and understand them a little bit better. So let me go through each of these features and talk to you about some examples and some ways that we think of them. So let's talk about directionality, and we'll start with the unidirectional ones. So a good example of a unidirectional connection is sediment flowing downriver and into the sea. So when that sediment comes down the river, it can have an effect on the organisms living in the intertidal. It can smother small polychaetes or other worms that are living in the sediments. It can completely alter those habitats, but it's definitely a unidirectional thing. It's coming from up there in the watershed and is flowing down to the bottom. So that's one of the things we actually, when it's unidirectional like that, and there's absolutely no way that the recipient habitat, the habitat that's getting the thing, can have an effect on it, we call that a donor-controlled system. So let me talk about a sort of classic bidirectional example. That could be the flow of nutrients or carbon in and out of estuaries, or the movement of fishes, which is what I illustrated here, moving between foraging habitat and refuge habitat. They go one place when they're hiding from predators, and another place so they can go get their food. So that's a bidirectional linkage. All right, let's talk about feedback again. I was hinting at this when I talked about the sediment being transported downstream, this idea of donor control. So if there's no feedback, if there's nothing that can happen in the second habitat that affects what was going on in the first one, that's sort of a classic case of donor control. And I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about a really nice example of that later on. But you could also have things where it's not donor controlled. And to jump back to that same example, broadly here, if you have some effect on the refuge habitat. So say that refuge habitat is being used by smaller individuals. Well, any effect on there is going to have a feedback, either positive or negative, on the adult population as well, or the larger population that's feeding somewhere else. So that's an example of, and it may be a very complicated feedback through this, organism A eating organism B, which then eats organism C, but the point being that you're getting a feedback. What happens in one system, it's not completely donor controlled. There's something that is feeding back on that. Okay, temporal variation, obviously if all connections you could argue are going to be dynamic if you view them on a long enough scale, but broadly what I'm talking about here is what's the principal scale at which these things change a lot. I put up a picture of the intertidal, the rocky intertidal, because that's a classic example of where the main variability is happening over tidal timescales. Roughly 12 hours, a couple times a day, you're getting the high tides coming up, and so that's the time scale that has the highest variability. But you can see there are other time scales there too. Every couple of weeks you get the spring tides and the neap tides, so there are other aspects as well. And finally, the biotic or abiotic mediation. And again, arguably all linkages are some combination of both, but principally you can often see the sediment example is often principally a function of abiotic things going on, rainfall, how clumped the sediment is, although there could certainly be biotic control as well, in that if you have more trees, they hold more sediment, so less can come down. So again, I want to point out that I'm treating these as dichotomous. We don't really believe it's black or white. That's one of the first things we learn in ecology, it turns out. So one of the things you can do is you can take these different axes. So in this case, I just took two of them, the feedback one and the directionality one. And you can see that, so unidirectional versus bidirectional and feedback or no. And then on the y-axis, you can put one of your other axes. In this case, I put time scale. And then you can look in this framework and you can sort of see in this three-dimensional space where any particular connection that you're talking about fits. So I'm going to come back to this diagram in a few minutes after I give you a specific example, and we can talk about where it would belong within that sort of framework. Okay, so with that as background, what I'm going to talk about first is an example of a habitat connection across, one of the most dissimilar pair of habitats you can have, the ocean and land. And to tell this story, I have to sort of go back a bit to talk about a scientist named Gary Polis. So Gary was my postdoc advisor. Gary was a famous ecologist who was famous for working on food webs. He made a lot of pretty important finds that changed the way food web ecologists look at food webs. Specifically, he tended to focus on desert food webs. And what Gary spent a lot of his career doing was sort of trying to figure out the strength and direction of all these arrows, of who's eating who, how energy is flowing through that system, etc. One of his study animals that he spent a lot of time working on, sort of his pet organism, was the scorpion, though. Gary absolutely loved scorpions, and he traveled the world, quite literally, going to different deserts and looking for scorpions. But then at one time, back in the late 80s, Gary visited these islands down in Bahia de Los Angeles, which is about halfway down the Baja Peninsula on the Sea of Cortez. And so he came out to these islands and he started sampling them, looking at scorpions. And you can see from this picture that there is just not much in the way of productivity on those islands. There's very few plants. Those plants that are there are slow-growing cactus that aren't very easy for anything to break down. And yet, when he started counting scorpions out there, he ended up finding that there were far, far more scorpions on those islands than there were on the mainland. And in fact, there were far more scorpions on those islands than he had ever seen in any of the other deserts in the world he had looked at. So he started thinking, all right, how are these scorpions being supported? There's not grass growing here that then bugs are eating the grass and they're eating the bugs. So where could it be coming from? Well, he realized it had to be coming from marine resources somehow. This had to be coming from the ocean because the Sea of Cortez is one of the most productive oceans on Earth, and it's right next to these islands with almost nothing growing on them. So he decided that that was probably what was happening. And it turns out that there are actually a couple of different ways this can happen. The two main ways it comes in, and I'm going to talk a little bit about both of them tonight, are through shore drift, where dead animals or algae wash up on shore, and that gets brought into the terrestrial system. And it also comes in through seabirds. Actually, seabirds both themselves dying, but one of the big ways they do it is by leaving their guano there. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So the word for this is allochthonous shore drift. Allochthonous means it's coming from another place and coming into this other system. So this is really one of the main pathways through which energy is getting transferred from the ocean onto these islands. And it's coming, this shore drift can be both animal carcasses or algal rack. Rack is a word we use for vegetation that's washed up on shore. One of the things I'd like to point out in this picture, it's a little tough to see, but if you look at this dead sea lion, right up there, those are two lizards that have set up feeding territories. So they're feeding on the flies that are feeding on the dead sea lion. So this is a really huge resource for these terrestrial organisms, and that's one of the ways that that's getting transferred on shore. So you might wonder, well, how much of this shore drift could there really be? So one of the things we did was went along, collected shore drift, weighed it, identified it, and one of the estimates we came up with was that for algae, for dead algae, algal detritus, it was almost 28 kilograms per every meter of shoreline you walk on these islands per year. And that's in dry weight, so it's a phenomenal amount of potential energy to get taken up by that terrestrial system. And within there you've got, again, tough to see here because they're flies, but there are little flies all over this algae just waiting to fly up and get caught by spiders, get eaten by lizards, etc. As far as carcasses are concerned, you can get, it's much less if you look at grams per meter per year, but it's still, between 100 and 500 grams per meter per year. And when you look at things like number of individuals, for pelicans on some of these islands, we're getting as many as 70 individuals for every kilometer of shoreline washing up a year. So that's a lot of energy. It's, if you count up that energy and measure it against the production created on the island, that's as much as 22 times the energy that is being produced right there on land. So it's a potentially great food source. The question is, does this translate into some sort of ecosystem effect? It's a nice theory, but does it work out? And there's a few ways we can attack that question. One is simply by counting how many organisms live near shore versus away from shore. So what we did was we did these different types of pitfall traps, these things called sticky traps, where you put glue traps up and catch all the insects that fly into them. The bottom line here is that you got anywhere from 2 to about 14 times as many organisms near shore relative to on the interior of these islands. So again, it's a nice piece of evidence that supports that, but it doesn't really prove that that's what's happening. But when you think about it more, there's another way you can attack this question. And you can look at perimeter to area ratio, because a smaller island or an island with a really complex shape is going to have a higher perimeter to area ratio. In other words, there's more linear meters of shoreline for every square meter of island if you've got a really complex shape or if it's a really small island. So you would expect that as perimeter to area goes up, you would get more production on those islands. You would find more secondary production, as we would call, things that are eating other things. And that is, you probably guessed this or I wouldn't have shown you this slide, that is exactly what we found. When you look at that, if you look at island perimeter to area ratio here on the x-axis And the mean, in this case, it's insect abundance. You see a really nice relationship with them. They're statistically significant. As you increase it, that perimeter area, you get more organisms. And you would find that, we found that same relationship for any organism we looked at, whether it was tenebrionid beetles or rodents or lizards. So it's a pretty robust finding. I mean, one of the things we've discovered from this is that it's increasing abundances in general when you're increasing connectivity here between these systems. We're having huge changes in community structure. Islands that get a lot of shore drift actually have different suites of species living there that are able to take advantage of that shore drift. It can strongly affect the stability on these islands, so depending on how much shore drift you get, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And one of the really interesting findings is this idea of subsidized predators or competitors depressing populations of some other target species. And quickly, what I mean by that is if you have coyotes, one of Dr. Polis's studies showed that coyotes were eating a lot of marine input. They were actually, they'll dig crabs out of the sand, they'll grab, seabirds when they can, etc. Well, what you're doing is now those coyotes living near shore can reproduce more, they can have a much higher abundance, and eventually, since they're territorial, they'll start shoving the smaller and younger ones inland. So now the inland area will have far more coyotes than it would have had, and even than it can support. But even though those poor coyotes that are stuck inland keep dying off, more of them are getting shoved in by that additional abundance that's coming in from the shore. So there's some really complex ecosystem effects here, and some things that that are affecting kilometers or farther away from where the actual marine input is coming. So if we were to look at this one, this is definitely a donor-controlled situation for the most part. You're looking at unidirectional and without feedback, right? That shore drift, there's nothing that poor coyote on shore can do to make more algae come up. So it's a unidirectional thing, and you'll find that it has these sort of important temporal frequencies. It's going to be happening generally on sort of seasonal time scales. There are certain times of year when you get more algae washing ashore. There will be a tidal component to it as well. And of course, you're going to see an interannual effect. If you have an El Nino event, you'll often get a lot of seabirds washing up on shore because the chicks don't make it through the season as well. So you'll see those sort of peaks showing up at different places on that graph. Okay, let me talk about another example. Let's go back to the less glamorous, but possibly even more important on these islands part of bird guano. So one of the things we looked at down here was this connection between open water, what's going on in the pelagic or open water environment, and what's going on in the rocky intertidal down here. So seabirds are foraging out in the open ocean, and then they come back to roost or to nest on these islands. So we hypothesized that what would happen is that these seabirds would be leaving their guano all over the rocks, which they clearly are, and that those added nutrients, that nitrogen and phosphorus, will lead to an increase in primary production in the intertidal, and that in turn might lead to an increase in the number of herbivores, the snails and the things that can take advantage of that. So what we did was we set up these intertidal transects. Here's a picture of some of the students working with me down there. We would set up transects on a beach that had a lot of guano input, and then we would pair each one with a beach that didn't have much in the way of guano input. Now, one thing I want to address here is that what's driving the guano input for the most part on these islands is the shape of the cliff above the beach. If the cliff overhangs, you'll get a bunch of guano on there. If the cliff sort of gently slopes back, then none of that guano is actually dropping down into the intertidal, or much less of it is. So we could find very, very similar rocky shores that were within just, tens of meters of each other in a couple of cases, and still they would have very different amounts of guano coming into that beach. So what we did was set up these transects. We went along and we turned over rocks, counted the number of organisms of all the different species we could see, and did that for each of these beaches and started to look at what were we seeing as far as abundance and what were we seeing as far as diversity, just measuring species richness. And what we found was that the mean number of organisms per square meter was significantly higher in the guano versus non-guano, and you also saw strong evidence that there is a change in diversity between these two systems as well. So that's great. So we have these differences in diversity, we have differences in abundance, but how do we know whether or not it's driven by these ornithogenic nutrients, which is our fancy way of saying bird poo? So the one way we can test that, we actually have a great tool that we can use for that, and that is stable isotope analysis. So I'm not going to go too much into stable isotope analysis, but most of you probably remember back to when you learned about how different atoms have different isotopes. And it turns out that bird guano has a lot of N15, which is an isotope, it's a naturally occurring isotope that's not super common in nature normally. For some reason, bird guano is very enriched in it. And one of the rules about isotopes is you are what you eat. So if you eat something that's really enriched in N15, your tissues will take that up, and then you'll be enriched in N15 too. So we decided we would expect to see an increase in this, they call it del 15N, so the fractionation is another word we use for it, at guano sites, if it's really guano that's fueling these differences. And again, the data strongly suggests that that's what's going on. The white are the guano sites, red are the non-guano sites, and you can see that it was elevated both in predatory snails. We only checked 2 different taxa here, but both predatory snails and the grazing chitons who are just going along the rock sort of grazing on algae. In both cases, they had higher N15 levels than they did in the non-guano ones. So our take-home message from this is that there's a very strong connection between the intertidal and the open water, and interestingly, it's mediated both by birds and by sort of the geomorphology, by what shape that boundary has, whether it's a steep cliff with an overhang or a cliff that leans backwards. So we see a strong connectivity there. Whether or not there's feedback is actually a really tough question, because if you're creating a beach that has an awful lot more snails in it, you might also be attracting a lot more birds that want to eat those snails, and then they'll be leaving their own guano there. So there's certainly a bunch of ways we could see that playing out as far as a feedback mechanism. So while there could be a feedback here, for right now, we'll call that tentative, and we'll say it's maybe no feedback, but getting close to that edge there. And we'll definitely call it unidirectional for right now, and the time scale on which this is happening is probably closer to the annual and interannual, right? Because it's mostly being mediated by the birds, which aren't there year-round. A lot of these birds are just there for the nesting season or as they're migrating through. So we're going to hopefully be learning a lot more about this. This is continuing research, and this is just some of our preliminary results from it so far. Okay, one other thing I wanted to talk about was productivity and diversity. So when we go back to that avian-mediated, the sort of birds controlling productivity, one of the other ways these birds affect the islands is not just by leaving their guano on the intertidal, but by leaving it on the island itself. Remember, this desert is one of the driest deserts on Earth, and so most years there is almost no water for anything to grow. But if you get a wet year, if you get an El Nino year, for example, with a lot of rain, and you have an island that had a lot of birds roosting and nesting on it, then after that rain, you can quite literally stand on shore, look at the islands, and based on how green they are, say, oh, that's an island that must have a lot of birds on it, that's one that must not, because you get so much more growth. You've just given these plants sort of everything they need now. So what we've done is sort of taken these data, we've looked through time, I'm only showing some of the data starting from 96 on, But these are sort of the dynamics looking at a particular group of organisms, the most abundant ground-dwelling organism out there, the tenebrionid beetles or darkling beetles. They're all related to the stink bugs that we all know so well from here. And what I did was I just color-coded this so you could see the bird islands are the red, non-bird are white. And if you look through time, what you're seeing is that the things that jump out at me, at least, are much more variability among those bird islands than the non-bird islands. Some years it's super low, some years it's super high. There's a little less of that with the non-bird islands, and that generally it looks like bird islands seem to have more beetles than do the non-bird islands. So what's driving that? You need one more piece of the puzzle to make it make sense, and that is understanding the weather. This was a typical dry year down there, and so they both bird and not bird islands didn't have much of an abundance of beetles because there weren't many beetles to be had for anywhere because there wasn't much productivity on the land. That next year was a very wet year if you look at our precipitation data, and you can see that that bird island responded really quickly. Suddenly the bird island had an awful lot more beetles, and it looks like you can kind of see a slower response, although I confess you have to squint and not look at error bars, but I suspect what you're seeing is a slower rise, a slower response on non-bird islands to that same phenomenon. Interestingly, if you go and look at the diversity on those islands, you see something very different. What you instead see is actually non-bird end up being generally more diverse. And that difference in diversity actually increases during some of these wet years. And the reason for that is that there are a specialized subset of these organisms that are adapted to do really well with that sudden flush of resources that come in. So it's sort of a race to see who can reproduce the most quickly, this sort of scramble competition to see who can make out the best with those resources. And so we actually broadly find higher diversity on non-bird islands. One of the things you typically expect to find in any habitat is the bigger the area, the more species you should find. There's a lot of different reasons why that would be, but broadly you can think of it as if you have a bigger island, you probably have more types of habitat, more room for more species. And so what you'll find is generally this species richness and a species area curve, they'll call it. So if you put the area of the island here on the x-axis and the number of species, and we log transformed them, but we don't need to talk about that. And then you look at them, you see that positive relationship. If you look at all the islands, yes indeed, a bigger island tends to have more. But look if you just pull out the islands without birds. It's yet another reason to suggest that there is this greater diversity on the non-bird islands. For the same level of, for the same size of any island, non-bird had a higher diversity than the bird islands. And the more we thought about it, what we ended up doing was these structural equation models, which suggest that what's actually happening on these bird islands is not entirely what I was suggesting earlier about its competition and pre-adapted, etc. A big thing that happens on bird islands is that what you're doing is you're reducing habitat heterogeneity. What does that mean? It means yes, you should have more diversity of habitats, but these birds get on these islands and cover everything with guano. Anything that manages to grow, they tear it down to build their nests with it. And so what you get is less diversity of habitats. That whole island becomes a lot more homogeneous. And so that probably is, our equation suggests that that's actually increasing the dominance on the bird islands and making them less diverse. Okay, let me talk a little bit about why we should care about this stuff, because at least to me it's pretty interesting just looking at it and understanding how it works. But a fair question, and one that I always want to be prepared to answer, is why should I care? And so there's a bunch of reasons you should care. One is the importance just to sort of theoretical ecology and oceanography. If you want to understand demographic effects, if you want to understand food web theory, how these food webs are put together, a lot of people spend their careers studying community assembly, or diversity and stability of systems, you really need to understand how these spatial subsidies, how allochthonous inputs might be having an effect. And I'd like to, it's having an effect on theoretical and conceptual models in ecology, but I'd like to give a more concrete example. One of my colleagues, Gary Huxell, worked with this other guy, Kevin McCann, and they do computer modeling and simulations of populations. And essentially what they've found is that low to moderate levels of spatial subsidy, so if you just have low and maybe a middle-sized level of that coming in, it actually increases the stability of the system. So you don't get as many wild changes, you don't get as many species going extinct. But that actually if you have either too much or too little, so it's sort of a Goldilocks situation, too much spatial subsidy can actually decrease stability. So it's not a simple, oh, we need more or we need less connection between these habitats. It really matters just how much is natural, so to speak. And with that in mind, obviously, there's a bunch of reasons this is important for conservation. There's, population persistence is going to be affected by these stability issues. When people are thinking about how big of a marine reserve should we build, well, it's important to understand how much area you need, where the energy is coming from to fuel the production there. So land use planning, one of the big examples is invasions, like this is ice plant, which has completely taken over one of the islands we study down in Baja California. Understanding how that's going to affect it, if things can use that as a subsidy, that might be a very important subsidy to that system. So obviously for conservation reasons, it's important. What I'd like to do now is just sort of, there are more examples than I could possibly give you of these connections, from salmon that swim upstream and then die up at the top of the river after spawning. What some of you may not know is that those plants that live up next to the river, actually their isotopes look like marine carbon. They actually look like the salmon because the salmon are giving a lot of energy to those plants. There's, dust in Africa can actually bring a lot of the nutrients that are fueling the growth of jungles. So it's in South America. There's amazing connections, but I wanted to give some that are a little closer to home for me. So I cannot give a talk without talking about my favorite fish, the California killifish. So I'm going to bring him into this. This was based on some of my PhD work here at Scripps, and I was looking at connections, but at a smaller scale, connections within a marsh. How are these different habitats, like intertidal pools and vegetated marsh and creeks, how are they connected? And the bottom line is that what I found was these fishes, depending on how old they were using different habitats, but they were also connecting different habitats differently depending on their age. So sort of through ontogeny, as that particular species, as they grow, these big guys are making daily trips with every high tide, often all the way up to the very top of the marsh and then back down to the very bottom. So anything that happens to affect this part of the marsh where they're trying to get their food is also going to affect what happens down here, because down here they're also eating some of the organisms. If you remove some of this food source for them, you're going to have an effect down here in the seagrass bed where now there's not as many fish to eat those things. So it's a really, for me, fascinating example of connectivity across habitats but within a single marsh. And it has a bunch of different aspects as far as temporal scale. It's happening on a tidal scale, but also through the life of a fish, it's having a differing impact on how it's connecting the habitats. The other one to talk about aliens is it turns out that in the Tijuana River National Estuarine Research Reserve, right down there at the border, what we discovered was that tamarisk trees, salt cedar is another common name for them, tamarisk, which is a well-known invader of riparian habitats, and it's a big problem in the Colorado River, Well, it turns out that we found the first recorded instance of tamarisk in salt water, actually invading a salt marsh. So these tamarisk were taking over a marsh that should be, you know, naturally it had pickleweed, which is, you know, maybe this tall, a ½ meter or so tall would be a big pickleweed. And now you've got tamarisk trees that are 8, 9 meters tall in some cases, living in that same habitat and completely taking it over. So we did some work with some Sea Grant funding looking at this issue. One of the interesting things, there's two big things about if we step back and look at the connectivity issues here. One is, this is a picture of the watershed. So this is all where all the water comes from that flows down the Tijuana River and into the ocean. And this right here is the US-Mexico border. So one of the interesting connections is that these tamarisks, the seeds that establish these tamarisk, were coming from all over this watershed, 3/4 of which is not even in the US. So, you know, we have no ability to control or even track some of that stuff very well. So that, for me, was a fascinating thing, both sort of politically and as far as just the life history of this thing. The other type of connection it's creating is now you've converted this marsh plain that should have tiny little plants to a giant, you know, forest that's sitting right there next to the intertidal zone, or is actually in the intertidal zone. So now you have things like red-tailed hawks potentially that can roost on there. They didn't used to have a great place to roost right next to the cordgrass, but now they can try and find the endangered clapper rails or other species to prey on down there. So there are some really interesting aspects of that, and I could give a whole talk on that, but I'll spare you. And so one of the last things I wanted to talk about that's really important to me is connectivity across disciplines. You know, we've talked a lot in the sciences about being interdisciplinary. So, you know, marine and terrestrial sciences need to interact more, which is why I sort of have one foot in both of those. But benthic and pelagic ecologists, all these different people sort of working together. And there are a couple of papers that I've actually written about this topic, one that just came out this last week, actually. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about this type of connectivity. So what I've been talking to you about tonight so far has all been about connecting different habitats with each other. You know, upland with the intertidal habitat where my PhD work was, looking in wetland mosaics. And it's certainly become a much bigger deal, and people are doing a lot more of this sort of cross-habitat studies. But one thing I think is still lacking is a lot more sort of working across sectors, so working between science and the public and, you know, NGOs, as well as education and management. And one of the things I'm really proud of that I'm involved in, Nigella talked about earlier, and that is the Ocean Discovery Institute. So my sort of other job that I have when I'm not being a professor is I'm the science director for the Ocean Discovery Institute. And we've been working, well, first a little bit about them. So they are a place-based sort of science education organization. And by place-based, I mean they work in a specific community. They call it a school shed instead of a watershed. I think that really just means district, but it sounds better to say school shed. But what they're doing is they're just working in the City Heights neighborhood. And so we have contact with these kids from the time they hit grammar school all the way through, you know, graduating from high school, hopefully graduating from high school. And we're integrated with their families. We know the people and they know us, which has been a real boon to us. And now these students, you know, it's all built on mentoring. So these students are coming back and mentoring the younger students and can understand what they're going through and where they've been. So it's really important, and we're sort of transforming these students' lives through what we call adaptive engagement. You may have heard of adaptive management, adaptive restoration. Well, what we do is we build this program around continually trying something new. You know, the part that works we keep, the part that doesn't we discard, and we keep on building a more powerful program every year. We take these kids to Baja for research. I should say that most of the data that I presented tonight were gathered working with these students. We've been working with NOAA, NGOs, and government agencies, so it's a real cross-sector experiment, and we have a big grant right now from the National Science Foundation with a bunch of money and effort. I actually can't say enough about how great University of San Diego has been about helping us and promoting this collaboration. So people often ask, well, what is ocean discovery? Are you guys a science group, or are you about education? And really what it's about is working at the interface of science and education and stewardship. And what we found is that, we're increasing self-esteem with these students. We're increasing diversity in the sciences. We're getting more of these underrepresented groups, starting to actually be part of the sciences, which is great for science as well as for the students. And it's based on authentic research. We don't put people in to say, hey, mix solution A with B and see how much you can titrate out, and then, like every other kid has done before you. These students are doing actual authentic research that's getting published. They're presenting it at meetings. It's really making a difference to science and the government. Down in, this is an example of one of our students, Amina. Her quote, I won't read it to you, I'll let you read it yourself, but I mean, it's inspirational to see a kid like this come from Ethiopia. When she joined our program, she had only been in the US 6 months or something like that, not very long at all. And now she is, up at, where is she? At UC Santa Cruz right now. So, and here, this picture I like especially for this talk, because this is Amina out on the islands where we do our research in Baja, and she is with our friend and Scripps graduate, Megan MacArthur, who is an astronaut. And so, just months before Megan went up into space, she was down here with Amina working, and Megan said, I think Amina is the bravest person I've ever known, which I think, coming from an astronaut, that's pretty high praise. And actually, the other thing I'd like to do, which I'm sure is breaking some sort of protocol, but I would like to ask Anaï to stand for a second. One of our students from the Ocean Discovery Institute gathered. This is Anaï. She is a bio major at UC Santa Barbara right now. She spent 2 summers working on the islands with me. She spent another summer doing sea lion research down there. She has been doing research every single summer at Santa Barbara with professors there. And now she is actually working with my former advisor, Dr. Lisa Levin, down at Scripps. And she's doing one of the summer undergraduate research fellowships, doing actual research again down there. So it's just, she is an example of what we love to see happen here. And so it really is making a difference there. Okay, let me summarize then. So I would summarize by saying habitat linkages are ubiquitous. Hopefully I've given you a bunch of examples that might convince you of that. The other thing that I think is underappreciated is that they can be the dominant factor that drives ecosystems. So we need to start incorporating these sort of spatial connections with our ecology and with our understanding of these systems. And importantly, we really need to incorporate these cross-discipline sciences. Right now we are doing work in Baja California with NGOs, with the Mexican government officials. We're working with Mexican scientists, US scientists, people from Stanford and Scripps. It's an amazing group of people working with, students. So we're getting education, we're getting diversity, we're getting a lot out of it, and I think cross-discipline science is really the only way to go. I'd also point out that that is a picture of me with 2 of my favorite animals, my daughter, Anna, and then that's a Fungulus, one of Parvipinus, the California killifish that she's kissing. So, come on, I mean, 2 of my favorites, and I will not say which one is, okay, she's my favorite, but it's close. It's nip and tuck sometimes. Obviously, all this work couldn't be done without a bunch of other people. I wanted to again stress how great the University of San Diego has been. They have put a bunch of money into creating a scholarship fund so that one student from this program, from City Heights, every year gets to come in and actually get a scholarship to be a USD student, which is a fairly pricey school. So it is fantastic, and we have all these different sort of structural supports to help with tutoring and keep everyone on track. Ocean Discovery Institute's been great, and without National Science Foundation and a bunch of other people in places, none of this would have been able to be done. I brought my own applause. I was not sure how this would end, so I wanted to be ready. And I'll take any questions. He was asking whether or not the flow is the same all around the island. So if this shore drift that's coming in, if it comes in some places more than other places. And the answer is yes, it does come in some places more than others. We have been using some of the current maps to look at where we would expect to find more of it, and then also doing surveys ourselves to look at where it's coming in. One of the problems is it's very seasonal, and it's also episodic. So it depends if you have a big storm event. You know, even when you might not normally get much shore drift, it'll rip up a bunch of that sargassum or other algae and dump it on shore. So what we really need is to be down there more often. Oh yeah, actually, it's so she asked if she said the students recruited seemed to be female. No, it's actually pretty even. Maybe I gave a misimpression in my. Maybe I used the more photogenic people. But no, we definitely, in fact, some years we've had some years where it was mostly males and other years where it was mostly females. But yeah, I don't feel like there's any bias in that. I hope not, anyway. So those guys are, if you look carefully, here's the hint. Look right there. They're blue-footed boobies. And they were in the midst of a big feeding frenzy, and that's what they look like when they're rocketing into the water to catch their prey. So she was asking about, commenting that there seemed to have been a lot of brown pelicans this year feeding near shore up here. And I don't know a lot about the pelican populations. One of the islands we study down there is one of the big nesting islands for brown pelicans, and it's right there in the bay. And this year, they actually had a pretty rough year, it seemed. There weren't very many successful nests. There were pelicans washing up on shore all summer. Quite literally, I don't think right at our field station we would get 1 or 2 a day for the period we were down there. So I feel as though it was a bad year for them down there, but the expert on brown pelicans actually is Dr. Dan Anderson up at UC Davis, and I have not talked to him in a year or so, so I'm not sure what's going on with them right now. So she was asking how I'm being bad about that, how my research might have relevance, or my methodologies might have relevance to the Galapagos. I mean, one thing I think would be really potentially important there is, for instance, you have the marine iguanas who are feeding subtidally. So there's a huge connection between terrestrial and aquatic, but in that case, you know, they're actually going down there and grabbing their own food. But what that means is that anything that affects those algae, so nutrients, water temperature, so potentially climate change, you know, you could have something affecting the subtidal community that actually is heavily impacting the entire island ecosystem, hypothetically. Yeah, it's, I mean, one of the things we struggle with where we are in Bahia de Los Angeles is that there's a new marina proposed there. There's a bunch of hotels that are potentially going to be going up. And you know, they just set up a new biosphere reserve there, and the initial plan, you know, they actually used our data to decide that it's not enough to just say we're protecting the islands. We need a buffer area around the islands because of these clear interactions. And I think it'll take a lot more research before we figure out precisely what size that buffer might have to be, but at least it's a good start.
Well, thank you very much for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.